Hey, this is Cedric, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. And before we get into this fantastic episode with Sebastian Bunney on the truth behind Bitcoin's opposition, I want to tell you about our amazing sponsors. The only way to truly own your Bitcoin is to get your BTC off your exchange and into a hardware wallet that you control. Now, make sure that you secure your Bitcoin from physical disaster and a single point of failure with a cipher wheel or the new CipherGrid seed storage device. CipherSafe's goal is to provide important tangible security tools for Bitcoin. CipherSafe focuses on securing your Bitcoin with beautiful, elegant, and practical devices. Designed, engineered, and manufactured all in-house, machined from solid stainless steel, not stamped out, waterproof, fireproof, rust-proof, foolproof. The cipher wheel is designed to be physically locked with a padlock and comes with a tamper-evident seal, so you can be aware of any attempts to steal your seed words. To keep your sats safe, go to ciphersafe.io and use the code MATRIX to get 10% off your order. Ledin offers interest-bearing savings accounts and Bitcoin-backed loans with the best rates in the entire industry, enabling users to access dollars or additional Bitcoin without needing to sell your existing holdings. Listeners of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast get $50 in USDC when you become a Ledin user and take out a Ledin loan using our link. To learn more, sign up at start.ledn.io/Bitcoin Matrix. Between working from home, mandates, and lockdowns, you might be thinking about adding an extra room at the house or renting a place to escape or retreat from encroaching communism. Citadel Cabins is in the custom building industry, and they are famous for small log cabins that can be shipped anywhere and easily assembled by you and a couple of friends in just a few days without any specialized skills or power tools required. Imagine adding a room to your house or dropping a cabin in the woods. As we descend deeper and deeper into clown world, the cabins are creating way for families to escape and establish KYC-free location sovereignty, surrounded by people who care about freedom as much as we do. Or maybe you want to get off the grid completely. If you are a landowner, investor, renter, or you want to provide support via your labor or expertise, Citadel Cabins has a program that's right for you. Citadel Cabins is a Bitcoin-only company that exists to help individuals achieve shelter, rest, security, and location independence. Head over to citadelcabins.com for more information and to fill out an application now. Bitcoin 2022 is the largest Bitcoin event in the world that takes place April 6th to 9th in Miami Beach, Florida. All 4 days will be jam-packed with exclusive content, exciting announcements, and an incredible lineup of Bitcoin speakers, artists, and leaders. Day one is Industry Day for enterprising Bitcoiners who are looking to build a business or career within the ecosystem. Days 2 and 3 are general conference days featuring speakers like El Salvador President Nayib Bukele, who has promised a big surprise, as well as CEOs like Michael Saylor, Elizabeth Stark, Jack Mallers, Adam Back, and hundreds more. The conference caps off on the 4th day with the world's largest and biggest Bitcoin music festival, Sound Money Fest, headlined by rapper and fellow Bitcoiner Logic, Steve Aoki, CL, Run the Jewels, San Holo, Deadmau 5, and many more. Last year's conference sold out, and this year's is on pace to be 3 times larger. So make sure you grab your tickets before it's too late. Visit b.tc/conference to learn more. Pay in Bitcoin to save and use promo code Bitcoin Matrix for 10% off, and I will see you in Miami. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix with Sebastian Bunney on how Bitcoin presents a threat to the United States dollar and its global hegemony backed by endless war.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Sebastian Bunney is the author of several essays, including The Truth Behind Bitcoin's Opposition, Bitcoin and the Illusion of Reality, He's the co-author of Bitcoin is the Perfect Option and Central Banks Will Have to Buy In with Greg Foss, all published in Bitcoin Magazine. Seb is exploring the world in search of understanding and truth while at the same time educating others. Seb, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot, Cedric. Yeah, I know we've tried to organize this podcast for a while, and so it's honestly a pleasure to be on here.
Yeah, I'm super excited. We have been kind of coordinate this for a bit, but I'm glad we got the time now. And I love your work. I think your articles are really impressive. There were even a few more that I didn't get to name, and maybe we'll touch on those. But I really want to focus on the truth behind Bitcoin's opposition. I think this just sort of layers into a lot what we're seeing now in ways that are sort of hard to maybe see even. But first, I kind of want to learn a little bit more about you and your background. How did you get into Bitcoin? How did you get into writing? What were you doing before all of this?
You know, I would say that it's not your normal foray into the financial markets. My background is actually I'm a mountain bike instructor. And I've been teaching mountain biking, working as a backcountry guide up in the Yukon and around other areas in Canada and down in South America. And over the years, I've always had that interest in the financial markets and investing just as a way to be able to support my love for kind of teaching people. And originally it started out as just kind of tinkering in the futures market and trying to trade oil and just getting absolutely wrecked. And then over time, I started to recognize that actually where I found my strength was looking at these positions that were kind of longer time horizons. And I went from going from day trading to swing trading to long-term trading. And then that eventually kind of just led me to Bitcoin, because I was I think a lot of the issues I'm facing is that our system is quite broken. We've got this very short-term time horizon and the short-term itch that everyone needs to have kind of scratched. And Bitcoin kind of fixes a lot of these issues. And so that kind of led me to Bitcoin, and now I'm kind of down the hole and quit my job, and I'm just focused on trying to educate people. That's my number one priority.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to go over there. I'm kind of curious, how did you get to maybe even hear about Bitcoin or come across it, and then make the leap to this is sort of a long-term, low time preference sort of investment or speculation or whatever it was at that point?
You know, I would say as I kind of worked my way out the kind of the time span of investing, I eventually found my way into kind of the Warren Buffett style of investing with value investing. Mm-hmm. And I found that phenomenal, because suddenly it was you're investing in products that you believe will help generations moving forward, and you believe in the product that you're actually investing in. But then I found that the foundation for which that was standing on, which was the financial markets, was kind of fundamentally broken. And I know Preston Pish, he describes it really well in a couple of his podcasts, where he says, when you're looking at real estate and when you're looking at bonds and when you're looking at equities, they may be great, but the problem is at the core of all of these valuations, you're looking at interest rates. And if interest rates are suppressed, well, then all of these things are overvalued. And if all of these things are overvalued, then what do you invest in? And so I started digging into gold, and then that led me into obviously Bitcoin. And so that was about two and a bit years ago. And I've just gone completely down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
I remember maybe in my early 20s, I kind of got a little infatuated with, Warren Buffett and maybe his style of investing. And also I remember Peter Lynch. I think he was the head of Fidelity and had a very successful track record. And he used to tell this anecdote about how his wife would see products in the supermarket and bring them home and tell him how amazing they are. And he would then do the research on those and kind of look at it more from the consumer angle, and still maybe long-term investments looking over their books. But yeah, and all those sort of, I've kind of drifted away maybe from a lot of that thinking in terms of following maybe individual thinkers or maybe their way of building or constructing a portfolio. Mm-hmm. I think while I was listening to a lot of that, I think you're still glossing over probably a lot of inside access that they have and sort of just different things going on there. But I one way you had of looking at things was, can you describe the Australian jewel beetle and maybe the issues they have? And kind of maybe perception and reality and seeing the world?
100%. That actually, so in one of my other articles, that's the start of the article, and it came from a TED talk where this guy was basically talking about do we see reality as it really is? And I think it's a really fascinating concept, because you would expect that, say, the jewel beetle, which is one of the oldest beings on Earth, it's been around for millions and millions of years, you would expect that if it has been around this long, then it sees reality as it is. And anyway, this kind of funny thing started to happen where they noticed the jewel beetle population started declining rapidly. And so they started digging into like, why is the population declining rapidly? And it turns out that the Aussies were throwing their brown beer bottles into the desert and just discarding them. And the jewel beetle was mistaking the brown beer bottle for the female jewel beetle. And so suddenly this beetle that's been around for millions of years, all it was looking for was the largest brown hunk of something, rather than actually being able to distinguish between a beer bottle and a beetle. And I think what the significance of that is that I think we very much believe that we see reality as it is, but I think that everything that we kind of do, we're just interpreting this data that's coming at us. And I think that for years, you can interpret data completely wrong. And I think, to be 100% honest, when you look at a lot of these leaders, whether we're looking at economists, whether we're looking at traders, whether we're looking at long-term investors, I think a lot of the time they view the world with their own kind of skew on things. And that's not to say I'm not doing that, but I think they view the world with their own skew on things. And I think it's quite detrimental to society. I think it's quite detrimental to the world we live in.
Yeah, I can see that. And I love the piece, The Truth About Bitcoin's Opposition, because I think it outlines a lot of maybe if we're fish swimming in water, what the water's like. So maybe we could start with just a really high level. What is money?
Yeah, oh, for sure. And like, if we go back, actually, I'll just quickly, like, if you were to summarize like the whole article, just so people can structure the narrative about what we're about to kind of flow through, the way I kind of think about it is governments like to target inflation because inflation centralizes power and it gives the perception of growth, although that growth is artificial. Now, the problem with that is that inflation destroys a currency's purchasing power and then undermines the trust in government. Now, the US is in a unique situation because it is the world reserve currency and it's got this thing called the petrodollar, which we'll talk about. It benefits from this artificial currency strength. And therefore, it's in the best interest of interest of the US to protect its global positioning. And so it does that through the military. And so this kind of thing kind of perpetuates a cycle where we're kind of destroying the currency in search of growth. And I think the people end up losing out. And this is kind of what I kind of discuss in the article. And then in the end, it kind of leads us to where we are now, which is what we're talking about, and that's Bitcoin. And so, yeah, we'll jump into, as you're just saying, which is the what is money. And I find the simplest way to kind of think about money is to break down like how one would obtain money. So now, like for the average person, there's basically just two ways to obtain money. And that's we either expend our time and energy in return for money, and that's like work, labor, services, or we trade goods and resources in return for money. However, to have obtained those goods and resources, we must have had to have previously expended time and energy in the form of like work. And so if you think of it in that way, money, all it is just our time and energy, and we're trying to store our time and energy in money. So Michael Saylor gives a really good example in the Robert Breedlove interviews. And he basically likens it to like a battery. Think of money as a battery. And we're always in search of the most efficient battery, the battery that can store our energy most effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. So basically we're left with the equation that money is time and energy.
Yeah.
And so then we're working with that. So how would you describe the monetary system, the role of the Fed, and how it is centralized?
Well, it's a tough one, because if we take a step back and we look at how money has evolved throughout history, if we're always, as Michael Saylor said, if we're always looking for kind of the best battery, the battery that stores our time and energy most effectively, then naturally you'd look at things like gold, or you'd look at things like Bitcoin. But the problem is, over time, people have had different preferences. And so we've managed to move across into fiat currencies, central bank digital currencies, because of their ease of use and their ability to transact, which older forms of currency, when we're looking at gold and we're looking at salt or glass beads, were more challenging. And so what's ended up happening is, throughout history, we've kind of moved towards this kind of sound store of money up until around kind of like the 18th century. And then it started drifting. And then we went to a more of a centralized form of money. And this is where governments really started to step in and kind of take control. And this has kind of led us to where we are today, which is this kind of centralized monetary system where we believe that money is by decree, as in the government sets the money, whereas throughout history, it's actually been, money has been something that has been generally accepted by the population. And so I think we've seen that shift. And so I would say like money is centralized because of people's desire for this fast, efficient, quick little system, but it's come a massive disadvantage, which is our store of value, which we'll get into.
Right. So I'm like, being that the system is so centralized, what are the tools that the Fed has, or the Federal Reserve has at its, in the toolkit? I want to discuss these, maybe like what is open market operations? For
sure. So when we look at the financial system, we tend to think we've just got money, but we've got the Federal Reserve sitting on top of the monetary system, and the Federal Reserve kind of regulates alongside the Treasury. It kind of regulates a lot of our money. And now you mentioned one of the tools that the Federal Reserve uses in order to create or impact supply and demand, in order to impact interest rates and things like that. And so open market operations is something that the Fed does. They're effectively buying short-term treasuries, which kind of give the bank more reserves for lending. And on top of that, it helps lower short-term interest rates. Now, what ends up happening is by lowering short-term interest rates, you help stimulate the economy and you end up kind of incentivizing borrowing. And on top of that, you're giving the banks more reserves, which allows the banks to lend out more. So what you've ended up doing is you've diluted the currency, you've expanded the monetary supply, and then you've started to see the first effects of inflation kind of taking hold. So prices start to rise, people start spending, debt starts to increase.
Right. And what is that? How is that similar or dissimilar than quantitative easing?
So quantitative easing it's almost the same as open market operations. Instead of buying the short-term treasuries, so you're impacting the short-term rates, you're now starting to look out a little further, and you're doing that on the long-term rates. So it's exactly the same in a sense that the Federal Reserve is buying long-term treasuries from the big commercial banks, and that is putting, if you think about it as in kind of supply and demand, because they're adding demand, then what happens is the interest rates start to lower. And then in return, those banks that are selling those long-term treasuries, they're getting increased bank reserves. And so then they can go out and lend that money, which helps increase the monetary supply. And kind of in the short term, it makes kind of things more prosperous because there's more money out there, there's more money flowing around. But in the long term, what ends up happening is we start to see price increases, which is what we're facing right now with all of this injection of liquidity from the pandemic.
Right. And then, so what is the discount rate?
So the discount rate is basically, it's the interest rates which commercial banks pay on short-term loans. So if a commercial bank pays a higher interest rate in order to borrow money on a short-term, like a short-term time length, what ends up happening is it's not incentivized necessarily to borrow that money. However, if the Fed lowers that rate, suddenly these banks, all of these commercial banks, they're incentivized to borrow in the short term. And so it helps kind of like, it incentivizes the lending of money. It helps them kind of like frees up liquidity. Now, the discount rate isn't necessarily like, it's an important function, but I would say that open market operations and quantitative easing are definitely the larger of the two which influence inflation.
Right. And then the last lever that they really throw at this, I guess the interest rate is the modifying the reserve requirements. And so how does that play out? And
so modifying the reserve requirements, if you think about it as, well, you've probably heard of the term the fractional reserve banking system. And this basically means that, well, traditionally, if a bank, say, had $100, it could only lend out $100. However, I believe it was in 1975, they started to implement what was called like the fractional reserve banking system, where banks could have $100, but they only needed to hold a portion of that in reserves and they could lend out the remaining. So let's say a bank has $100, but there was a 10% fractional reserve requirement. That basically means that with $100, they could lend out $900 more dollars. And so in total, there's now $1,000 in the system, but they only hold 10% of it. So they're holding a fraction of what they lend out in reserves. Now, we tend to think of that as being fixed, and most people assume that it's around 10%. But at times when the government wants to stimulate the economy, the Federal Reserve will lower that requirement. And so we saw this during, I believe, the pandemic, where they lowered it to 0 so they could try and like stimulate the economy by getting money out there, and they didn't have to hold those reserves kind of in the back of the bank.
Right. So now we got these four major tools, all aimed, it seems, at interest rates and suppressing interest rates, or I guess raising them when needed. What are the effects of all this sort of inflation on the monetary system or the unit?
Well, I think that the key question to kind of ask is like, why do they use these? And why do they use these will then be able to answer more about kind of like what the effects are. And I think that if we look at the Fed and kind of what their role is, like they basically have a dual mandate, or it's more of a tri-mandate than a dual mandate. And they're basically, their dual mandate is maximum employment, price stability, and an inflation target of 2% per year. And so then they use these monetary tools in order to stimulate employment, in order to kind of like create price stability, and in order to kind of target this 2% inflation rate. And so like an example of that would be, let's say the economy starts stagnating and they want to try and kind of create growth. Well, if they start doing quantitative easing and they lower those long-term interest rates, well, suddenly it becomes more favorable to start borrowing. And so people can actually start going out there, they can start new businesses, big businesses can obtain that money to put into capital expenditure and things like that. But the downside to this, as you said, there's always going to be kind of byproducts to tinkering with the money. And kind of the most pertinent one that is what a lot of people are talking about at the moment in our system is that when we start devaluing the currency by inflating the currency and inflating the supply, you get a whole lot of knock-on effects. And so the first one is wealth inequality. And if you think about who holds the money, the majority of people that hold money tend to be the lower and middle class wage earners, whereas the upper class people tend to hold assets. And so if you devalue the currency, well, the lower and middle class that hold the currency, they lose purchasing power, whereas the upper class who hold all of it, who immediately go out when they obtain money and they go and purchase assets, well, that money funnels into assets and asset prices go up. So you end up creating this wealth inequality where we see a centralization of power in those that hold assets and this kind of collapse of the middle and the lower class.
Right. And so, I mean, I think also some of the other maybe second order effects that you mentioned are, so obviously dilution of the monetary unit, where affecting interest rates. What I think is very interesting is sort of the loss of accurate measurement. And we could do a whole podcast on that. The distortion of economic indicators. But, and I think what we're getting at here too, with sort of purchasing power is that and you make this note, and I like the way you frame it, is that I guess not all dollars on the Fed balance sheet make it into the public domain. I think that's sort of interesting to note.
And, I think quickly, like you brought up a couple of really good points. And I think that the dilution, I think what people struggle to grasp is if you go back to say like a gold standard, if the government wanted to expand the monetary supply, the only way it could do that is by obtaining gold. And so it would have to go on a little war mission and go and pillage another country in order to kind of steal their gold, and then they could come back home and expand the monetary supply. However, when it came to kind of the fiat standard, you no longer need to expand the monetary supply by obtaining more gold. You're able to just take on debt to expand the monetary supply. And so people tend to think that, let's just say like hypothetically that there was, for easy math, there's $1 million in the US. Well, if you expand the monetary supply to $2 million, and the example I give in the article is kind of a pizza example. If you expand the monetary supply, that's not equivalent to doubling the amount of pizza. What expanding the monetary supply is equivalent to is, let's just say you have 4 slices of pizza. If you doubled it, well, now you have 8 slices of pizza. And so each of those people that previously owned a quarter of the slices of pizza, they now only own an eighth of the slice of the pizza. And so each person has been diluted, and they've lost pizza or they've lost purchasing power. Yeah.
And I think maybe the other form of dilution that's like external dilution, or you can go and acquire the gold from another, or internally, I think, coin clipping historically is a way to steal from your own citizens and people. So I think this kind of brings up an interesting topic. And what is then financial repression?
So financial repression, I talk about it in the article in under the kind of the premise of that when a government is kind of put in power. Now, some people may disagree with taxes, but taxes, I think, are 100% necessary in order for a government to be able to fund its operations and do what it needs to do. Now, the problem is, I agree with taxes as long as they're being transparent. And so that's like corporate taxes or sales taxes or income taxes, things like that. But a lot of people don't necessarily know that first, they're being taxed through inflation, which is what we're just talking about, where we get the devaluation of our currency. But also they're being taxed by financial repression, which is what you brought up. And financial repression, if you think that, say, like, well, the easiest way I kind of think about it is if you think that inflation is, say, for easy math, 10%. And that would mean that if someone wants to lend you money, well, they want to at least cover the inflation rate and a little more for their risk of taking on that loan. And so they may want, say, 15%. So that means that after let's say a year of kind of lending out this money, then they pocket the difference because inflation is 10% and they're lending out at 15% interest rate, then they make 5%. The problem with the government being able to set interest rates is that it can set interest rates below that of inflation. And so suddenly it becomes advantageous to actually borrow money because you're passing on the borrowing costs onto the person who's lending you the money. And so an example of that would be, let's say this inflation rate is 10%, but you could borrow money at 5%. Not only are you borrowing money kind of below that of inflation, but you're basically passing off that 5% difference onto the person who's lending you the money, because at the end of the year, you're getting paid back the money you lent them at a 5% loss of purchasing power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's wild. And it's just I think that just distorts everything in so many ways. Do you then?
100%.
Yeah.
Well, no, and I think that the thing which it's hard to wrap your head around how that impacts us, but the way that impacts us is if you are a creditor instead of a debtor, so a debtor being someone who borrows money, a creditor being someone that lends money, if you have a pension fund or you have investments in the financial markets or you have a bank account that is trying to gain interest, suddenly you have now got these suppressed interest rates. So you're basically paying for the government to borrow money. And so you're funding the government's deficits, you're funding the government's operations, and people have no idea about this. And so it's a form of, just like inflation, it's a form of hidden taxation.
Right. So then, in all of this, we've mostly spoken about how the government influences and manipulates interest rates. So why do the banks then have so much power or get the ability to do fractional reserve banking?
So I would say that there's two main things. The first one is lobbying, and the second one is that the banks are the guys that kind of facilitate this. And so we'll start on lobbying, and that is that the government benefits so much from the lobbying system. And now this isn't the same in every single country. Every country is kind of unique as to kind of how their system is structured. But in the US, I believe in 2020, in the election system, the Wall Street banks and the financial services ended up spending $2.9 billion on lobbying, and the government benefits directly from that. And so first off, they're benefiting on a lobby front. But then the next reason why kind of the banks kind of end up with so much power is the fact that they're the ones that kind of lubricate the system. And if the Federal Reserve gives the bank, say, an increase in reserves, well, then that money isn't able to be spent directly into the economy. Reserves are held at the Federal Reserve. Now, the banks are the ones that end up, they can lend on these reserves, and that money then trickles into the economy. And so without the banks, this money would never make it to the economy. And so the government puts a lot of trust and has a lot of reliance on the banks in order to stimulate the economy. And so this is why the government always wants to try and maintain a strong relationship with the banks, because if the government pisses off the banks are just going to stop lending, and then it directly impacts the government's ability to kind of maintain its strong currency or maintain its kind of perception of kind of faith from the economy. Yeah. And I would say, like, that brings about like one interesting point which you don't have to go into, but one of the reasons why the government wants to go down the central bank digital currency route is because suddenly you can now bypass all of the banks, and now the government can be directly impacting the consumer, like you or I. Right.
And another interesting fact that you note in the article was that there's 28 trillion, I think, in U.S. debt. Mm-hmm. And so, do you agree with Robert Breedlove that this is modern day slavery?
I think if you look at inflation as the theft of time and time and energy, because inflation is effectively the theft of money, because you're stealing someone's purchasing power. And if you go back to our example at the start of kind of the talk, where we break down money is equal to time and energy. And so when the government is coming and stealing your purchasing power. What they're doing is they're stealing your time and energy. And I would 100% liken that to kind of another form of slavery, because if you think back to what slavery is in its simplest term, you're just using someone else's time and energy for your benefit. And it doesn't, I would say, like, people can agree or disagree on this, but I would say that it doesn't matter if the person knows whether or not you're using them for their benefit. And I think that's where we're at right now. Is slavery was more explicit, whereas now it is more implicit. Like we don't know that we are being used as slaves, whereas I think during the African slave trade, they knew they're being used as slaves.
Yeah, right. It was much more overt, obviously.
Yeah.
So what are the two benefits that the U.S. has over every other country regarding, I guess, fiat and money printing?
100%. And so that kind of goes down into like why. So at the start, I kind of break down kind of how I view this whole article. And so far we've talked about kind of the inflation side of things, and that the government benefits from inflation. And so then it goes down into how the government, like the problem with inflation is that obviously it devalues the currency, which ends up kind of reducing people's trust in the government. So the US is in a really unique system, and that is that it has the world reserve currency, and it's got this thing called the petrodollar. Now, the world reserve currency has a huge benefit to the US because, first off, countries, the majority, and at the moment it's been dropping for the last handful of years, and I believe, and don't quote me on this, I believe it's about 60% of world trade right now is done in US dollars. And so that's huge for the US because it means that there's all of these countries that are constantly in search of dollars to be able to facilitate trade, to be able to pay off US dollar denominated debt. And so with this demand for dollars, you've always got this strengthening of the currency. So now that's the world reserve currency. The other one is the petrodollar. Now, in 1971, there was a major event called the Nixon shock. And the Nixon shock was basically when we went from a gold standard where our currency used to be backed by gold to the fiat standard, which now our currency is not backed by anything but debt and a faith in the government. Now, what ended up happening is the moment Nixon announced this, the currency started to collapse in price because people are like, hey, I don't want a currency that's backed by nothing but faith. And so the US quickly needed to find a way to strengthen the US dollar. And so what did it do? It went out and it tried to, basically, it pushed OPEC, which is kind of I've completely forgotten the name of what it stands for, the petroleum. Anyway, it's basically
Petroleum Economic Consortium, maybe?
I think it's something like that. And it's basically the group of OPEC, or the group of oil nations that provide kind of oil to the world. The majority of these nations, the US managed to persuade them, especially Saudi, which at the time was the largest oil producer and oil supplier, they managed to persuade them to facilitate gold trade in US dollars. Now, that is huge because suddenly all of these countries that pretty much every country globally needs oil, they have to purchase in US dollars. So one, they have to sell their currency in order to obtain dollars, which devalues their currency and strengthens the US dollar. And then they have to go and obtain like oil. But in the meantime, while they're holding those US dollars, the US can not only devalue their currency, which impacts obviously its people, but it's impacting all of these countries that hold US dollars. So the US can continue this whole push of inflation without impacting the currency to the same extent that a currency that wasn't kind of the petrodollar, wasn't the world reserve currency. Now, it's called, Alex Gladstein has a few really good talks on this and a few really good articles on this. And he refers to it as petrodollar recycling, whereby the US are now in this incredible incredible position, whereby because trade is done, oil trade is done in US dollars, they can print dollars in order to buy oil, which is basically kind of the lifeblood of all of these economies. All these other countries obviously have to sell their currency in order to obtain dollars to go and buy the oil. But not only that, a lot of these countries want US treasuries, the US treasury bonds. And so they then, the moment they kind of sell oil and obtain dollars, they then go and purchase US treasuries, which basically pumps money back into the US. And you've got this petrodollar recycling, you've got this circle of kind of money, the US spending dollars, and Saudi and these oil producing nations just going buying US treasuries, which puts the money back into the US. So it's got this cyclical currency strength, which massively benefits the US. And so if you then think about like stepping back, it's got the world reserve currency and it's got the petrodollar. Well, it's got to protect this. And it's got to protect it in a big way because it benefits immensely above and beyond every other currency out there.
So how does it protect this privilege?
So this then goes back to the whole military thing. And I think a lot of people, they believe that government goes out there and it fights these wars in order to protect the people and in order to protect kind of they believe the US is being altruistic and it's going out there and it's protecting the rights of people out there and people's freedoms. And the reality is, I think if you start looking at some of the data, it becomes clear that I don't necessarily believe that that is necessarily the case. And like a perfect example of this would be, you just need to look at government spending and where government spending goes. And so if we look at, say, mental health and drug addiction, there are 95,000 people a year that die from mental health and drug addiction. That's on average. Now, if we look at government spending, in 2015, I think there was $5 billion spent, and there's 95,000 people that have died. So that's equivalent to $56,000 per death. However, if we look at something like counter-terrorism and military spending, well, counter-terrorism alone had $146 billion instead of this the mental health and drug addiction, which had $5 billion. So it had, what's that, like 36 times increase in spending in counterterrorism. Well, how many deaths were there? There's 58 deaths. Instead of 95,000 deaths for mental health and drug addiction, which only had $5 billion of spending, there was 58 deaths for $146 billion of spending, which dollars per death, that's like $2.5 billion per death. Like, you can see that they're directing their resources towards counterterrorism, military spending in order to kind of like prop up and support the dollar, as opposed to supporting their internal people. Like, we've got 95,000 people dying of mental health and drug addiction. Like, why not fix that?
Yeah. So then we get into, we talked about 1971, the petrodollar and Saudi Arabia. Fast forward a bit and we can bring up Saddam Hussein, Iraq, Hugo Chavez, Venezuela, Gaddafi, and Libya. So what are sort of these economic hitmen?
So I would say, so those people you mentioned, Saddam Hussein, Hugo Chavez, and Gaddafi, and I give all this credit is to Alex Gladstein. He has done incredible research into this. So when you look at these wars, initially, when you look at any of the media surrounding them, they're always portrayed as these, as I mentioned earlier, these altruistic, like, we're trying to go in there, we're trying to free people. It's about kind of like stopping this oppression. It's about kind of saving these countries. But the reality is, if you look at Saddam Hussein, like, Iraq is in 5th place for the largest known oil reserves in the world, with 8.7% of total known oil reserves. Hugo Chavez Venezuela basically has the largest known oil reserves in the world, with 18.2% of total oil reserves. Gaddafi is Africa's largest oil known reserves and is 9th place in the world. And now all three of these people, they've got something in common. They all announced that they were basically transitioning off the trade of oil and dollars, and they wanted to transition to, Saddam wanted to transition to euros. Hugo Chavez wanted to transition and kind of remove kind of the US dollar from this kind of beneficial position. And Gaddafi wanted to move over to the gold dinar and to divert oil revenue towards kind of state-controlled funds and away from the US. And in every situation, the moment they were either killed or war took place, or in Hugo Chavez's position, he was kind of there was a coup staged and he was forcibly asked to resign. In all of these situations, it basically, the US prevented this transition away from the US dollar and into euros or into the gold dinar. And so one could argue that these major wars were not about going in there and saving the country and saving the people. What they're really about is protecting the US dollar, because in the event that the US no longer had the world reserve currency status, or the petrodollar started to fall apart and people started to trade in currencies other than the US dollar for oil trade, suddenly the US could no longer inflate the currency to the same extent that it has been doing, because it gains all this artificial strength from the petrodollar and from the world reserve currency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And, I almost feel like maybe the jewel beetle trying to figure all this stuff out. And, we've kind of outlined 1971, the Nixon shock, OPEC, the petrodollar, Saudi Arabia, talking about Iraq and Saddam. And I think one thing that's that's always kind of, maybe not always, but very overlooked is 9/11 there. and Saudi Arabia's connection to the 15 of the 19 hijackers. And I can't help but maybe I don't know how that's a dot connected in all of this, but I'm fairly certain it is, and I'm just not sure if it's similar to the others. And who are the jackals beyond sort of the economic hitmen?
Well, so we'll jump into that in 3 seconds, and I'll just mention the whole Saudi thing. And what's really interesting, and this goes back to the whole jewel beetle thing, is we're kind of given this partial view on things that's very distorted, and we believe that these wars were done to protect the US or to protect these countries for their horrendous dictators. But if we look at Saudi, now Saudi has like direct connections with Al-Qaeda, which was so-called as the guys behind 9/11. And on top of that, there's direct evidence that they ended up killing that Washington Post columnist. I can't pronounce the guy's name. Yeah, and there's like direct evidence against this, but the US never ever goes in and kind of takes a stand and says like, hey, no, like, what are you guys doing? And I think the reason why is because Saudi provides a third of the US its oil. And between like 2015 and 2019, Saudi alone purchased a quarter of all of the US arms exports. And so going back to this whole jackals and the economic hitmen, I think where it's kind of a slight little tangent, but if you ever read the book, it's called, what is it called? It's John Perkins and Stories of an Economic Hitman, I believe is what it's called. And he basically talks about his experiences as an economic hitman, and what their role would be to go into these small little countries that have these amazing natural resources or powerful leaders or whatever that may be. And the US wants to gain kind of a piece of this pie. And so what they would do is they would go in and they say, hey, you don't have the money to be able to kind of make the most of your natural resources. So how about we go in and we lend you this money, and we'll lend you this money. And if we do if we dig in and we kind of like determine how much your oil is going to return, we can then figure out how much money you need how much money you need to borrow. And so what they would usually do is they would go in, they would kind of do this report, they would come out and they would say, okay, well, let's just say you've got X amount of oil and you're able to export it at this amount of rate, you can borrow this amount of money. They would go lend this amount of money, but what they would usually do is massively overproject the amount of resources that and the amount of money they'll be able to generate from their natural resources. And so what would happen is these countries would default on this debt that the US has lent them, and then they would come in and they'd say, hey, you know what, like, because you defaulted on this debt, we either want to take control of these natural resources, or you've got to give us political control or military control. And so this is another way that the US kind of slowly infiltrates all of these countries. And so I think that, and this is getting a little more conspiracy theorist, but I think that a lot of people believe that we've got all of these independent nations all around the world. But I think the reality is the US has its fingers in the pies of many of these smaller little nations, and people have absolutely no idea. And so if you read this book, Theories or Historians of an Economic Hitman, what you start to realize is that they're involved in every single one of these little countries. And when these countries do not do as they say, well, then a lot of the time the jackals come in, which is what you mentioned, and the jackals come in and they assassinate or they take down a lot of these leaders in order to get them to comply. And so I think that the world is, we don't see the world as it really is. I think we have a very skewed idea. And what's happening now is China is going down that exact same route with what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And China is going into a lot of these countries, and we're seeing it in like Ethiopia, or we're seeing it in a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, where they're going in and they're saying, hey, we want to help you. We're going to lend you this money. But a lot of the time, they massively overproject how much money they can lend. And then these countries default and China ends up gaining control. And so there's a fight right now between kind of China, the US, and Russia in there a little bit as well.
Yeah. It's interesting how you bring up the altruism or maybe the lack of altruism that the governments or the U.S. government have in sort of these expeditions around the world and military endeavors, and why we're spending all this money on military might. Should maybe Americans or anyone in the West who really benefits from this system, once we're aware of sort of this lack of altruism on the government's part, should we be altruistic for altruism's sake, or should we be appreciative of maybe the advantages that we're giving from maybe manipulating these other societies, or should we be thankful? I mean, should we have wished we never went this way? What is one to make of this now that you know that it's not so altruistic? Should we be appreciative of the benefits it's brought us?
100%. Yeah, and this is the thing that's really tough. And I know Jason Lowry has some amazing tweets and amazing kind of talks on this. And I think that the challenge is, if the US doesn't do this, is another country going to just go and do this? And then the US becomes one of these countries that is kind of at kind of the feet of these larger nations. And that's kind of the challenge. And what is interesting, and this is kind of where it starts kind of moving on into Bitcoin, is traditionally, if you wanted to maintain control, well, you needed to have that military might. And so that is why the US is it has this global hegemony. But with Bitcoin, we transition away from having to have military might in order to have control, in order to a currency that is completely decentralized. And so no individual has that authority in order to control large swaths of people. Suddenly, the individual has sovereignty over his own power. And what's really interesting with that is the fact that because you can hold your private keys in your head, suddenly we dematerialize borders. Because if you don't agree with what your government is doing, if you don't agree with kind of the path that your government has taken, well, then you can move country. Now, that's so much harder with a lot of these other traditional assets, whether we're talking about real estate, whether we're talking about equities. It's really hard to move these assets, and even cash, it's almost impossible to move large sums of money overseas. Whereas Bitcoin, we have sovereignty over our own capital. And so suddenly it goes from us being of service to our government to the government, or going back to our government being of service to us. If it wants to obtain capital for taxes, to fund operation, all these kind of things, suddenly it has to act in the best interest of its population, which I think is amazing. I think this is the first time in history that suddenly government has to act in the interest of its people, as opposed to the people having to comply with whatever government kind of says. And this is where I think Bitcoin is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And so I think that's where Bitcoin stands in all of this. I mean, sort of the fixed supply that you're talking about, the self-custody, decentralized nature of it. So then why is maybe such strong opposition come from certain individuals in the government?
I think that when we look at why Bitcoin is facing opposition, and so if you just have to look at the FUD, the fear, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that is pushed out there. And if you break down the FUD, you realize, when you're kind of in the know and you've done your own research, that most of it is BS. And when you realize that most of it is BS, you're like, well, then why are they doing this? And so when you look at, say, Janet Yellen, from the head of the Treasury, she constantly comes out repeatedly, and it's the same with Elizabeth Warren. They constantly come out and they tout the criminal use of Bitcoin, or they tout the energy expenditure of Bitcoin. But if you actually look at the criminal use is significantly less than our current cash system. It's significantly less than US dollar system. If you look at the energy expenditure, if you kind of tally up the energy consumption between banks and the AC and the food to be like feed the workers of these banks and our kind of our whole monetary system, it's significantly more than Bitcoin. And no one's willing to make that comparison. And the reason why they're kind of touting these things, and I believe they know they're wrong, but it's because it doesn't matter. It's Bitcoin threatens the US. It threatens its ability to run this inflationary monetary system. And because of that, the Bitcoin will continue to be a threat until we either transition to a new system or Bitcoin is destroyed. And obviously, I hope that it's the former.
Right. And so do you ever think we'll see someone in power who wants what's best for the people?
Well, so this is the tough thing is, I would say that some people come back and they say, well, why does Bitcoin necessarily have to be the world reserve currency? Why does Bitcoin have to be a country's legal tender? And I would argue that there will always be times when there are going to be great leaders, and there will always be times when there's going to be poor leaders. But the thing is, because we don't know when there's going to be a great leader or a poor leader, if we put a currency that cannot be manipulated into that position of world reserve currency or legal tender, suddenly that means that no matter who the government is, or no matter who it is that is in power, they cannot act in their own interest in order to facilitate wealth to their family, themselves, their friends. They have to act in the interest of the population. And so I would say that what Bitcoin does is it makes for an honest government, because suddenly those in power are not incentivized to corrupt the system or manipulate the system to their benefit.
Right. Do you think, and I agree there, do you think that people in government are aware of the Triffen paradox?
So this Triffen paradox you kind of talk about is an issue that basically, if you look all the way back through history, and I know Ray Dalio in a lot of his writings, he talks about this a lot. And that is that if you go back, I don't know how far back it goes, maybe let's just say he goes back about 2,000 years, I believe. And you look at all of the global world reserve currencies. Now, throughout history, they've only ever lasted around 150 to 300 years, and they always end up failing because of this thing called the Triffen Paradox. And the Triffen Paradox is basically that if you want to be the global world reserve currency, well, then you want to ensure that countries have access to your capital, countries have access to your currency. And so what you do is you end up destroying your manufacturing base, and you create a consumption import-based economy where you're basically importing goods into your country as opposed to exporting. Now, what ends up happening is because you are importing, you're spending money that goes out into the world. But the problem is you are now destroying your internal, you've destroyed your manufacturing base. And so the Triffen paradox is basically that if you become the world reserve currency, you end up destroying yourself anyway in order to become the world reserve currency, because you no longer have a manufacturing base. And then over time, your currency ends up collapsing. And so it's kind of this cyclical phenomenon. And we, at the moment, I feel, and a lot of other people, I believe, feel the same. I believe the US is coming to that 100-year reign mark where it's starting to feel the effects of the Triffen paradox, where it's destroyed its internal manufacturing base. And we see China and we see Pakistan and Vietnam and a lot of these other countries coming up with their manufacturing. And we're now at the whim of a lot of these countries. And yes, they may be at the whim in terms of the currency, but if they decide to stop using the world reserve currency, the US is screwed. And so the Triffen paradox is this kind of this issue that the US faces. And I believe they do know that they face this issue, but I think the problem is our system is a term-based system. It's only like people are in power for 4 years. And so they're not incentivized to think long-term. And this goes back to the whole Bitcoin thing is we should be shifting our focus to long-term, because if we want prosperity and we want kind of the best outcome for humanity, we can't think in a quarterly basis or a yearly basis or even a 4-year basis. We need to be thinking in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year timeframes, I think, in order to kind of help improve our prosperity.
Yeah. Someone seems to be thinking long-term since 1971. I'm starting to think that, another missing detail, or just not as talked about as much, as maybe it wasn't so much the Nixon shock as maybe the Kissinger shock, because he still seems to be playing a large role in a lot of these world affairs. And Nixon's long gone and didn't have much of an impact after his presidency. And I can't, one of my strongly held opinions that are my strong opinion, loosely held, I can't figure out how El Salvador plays into this, but I somehow think Tonga does. I just think it was a little odd what happened recently with Tonga and their sort of recent announcement with maybe moving to a Bitcoin standard. And and it was interesting, some of the military adventures we've gone on have not all been successful. Like maybe the coup with Chavez. I mean, even though maybe his policies were hindered, he still remained in power. And then maybe in Syria, maybe we were checked there by Russia. And it's so hard to tell as the jewel beetle what the intentions were and whether goals were met. But it does seem like someone's thinking about it long term. And in terms of maybe long term, or even maybe, well, I guess at the end of a long term, if America as the sort of the money printer of the world, if that role were to demise, whether it's the empire or the world reserve currency, sort of irrelevant in terms of the question, but who do you think would pick up the mantle? And do you think it would be an individual country, or some sort of global SDR or CBDC?
Well, so you make a couple really good points. And even though I know Warren Buffett is very much against Bitcoin, he has a really good saying, and you guys have probably heard it, which is, when the tide goes out, you understand who is swimming naked. And I think this goes back to the whole El Salvador thing. They may be being criticized right now, but I think that when we start to see a deflationary shock on the system, and what do I mean by a deflationary shock is because we've taken on so much debt, and because we have this belief that we can constantly expand infinitely and that we have infinite resources, once people recognize that we don't have infinite resources and we cannot expand infinitely, we're going to see a massive contraction. But because of this debt, we're just going to see a massive amount of contagion and a bunch of defaults kind of, I think, wipe clean a lot of our financial markets. And when that happens, the countries that obviously hold true raw value are going to be the ones that are going to be benefiting. And I think those countries are going to be ones with, whether it's large gold reserves or large natural resources that haven't been kind of exploited by debt, or whether it's El Salvador, Tonga, and some of these countries that are starting to go down the route of Bitcoin adoption. Because in the grand scheme of things, I see gold very much in the same light that I see Bitcoin, whereby Bitcoin is it's the extraction of energy, and gold being the extraction of a natural resource. Bitcoin is the extraction of energy that can be used at will, and it isn't depleted like holding the US dollar or something else.
Right.
So, and I think, like, to answer your question though, about like, who's going to pick up the mantle? I think this is such a tough one, and I don't necessarily know if I have an answer, because I think it could go many, many different ways. If I was to answer what I hope, I would hope that we start to see a world where we have a lot more Bitcoin adoption. That doesn't necessarily mean that Bitcoin needs to be used day to day. Now, I know that we have things like the Lightning Network, but if we have Bitcoin even at the foundation of our monetary system, so that people have a reliable store of value to move back into, I think that people would, I think that would change our time preferences, and I think it would help immensely with our consumption-based economy. I think it would help immensely with normalizing interest rates. I think it would be phenomenal, and I think it would help immensely with kind of this decentralization of power and this kind of this normalization of this wealth inequality. I think we would start to see this distribution of wealth back into the lower and middle class, because if you're paid in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is a deflationary asset in the sense that it actually gains purchasing power as opposed to loses purchasing power, then naturally we see the decentralization of wealth again, which is, I think, absolutely phenomenal. But of course, it goes against what many governments believe.
Yeah, I could see that. I do think the opposition is fierce, and I think the struggle is obviously real. I'm kind of, you brought up one of your articles I do want to touch on is Bitcoin and the Metaverse. And what kind of chasm, what chasm are we facing or here with this Metaverse and Bitcoin?
So I highly recommend going and listening to Robert Breedlove does a talk with Raoul Pal. And in it, he basically goes through the whole narrative of kind of the gold standard, going through into the kind of the fiat standard. And then you see kind of the historical realization that we are at this major like issue. We're at this major kind of like pivotal shift right now. And that is the fact that we have lived in this world where we've had excessive population increases. And that with population increase, we've had increased spending. And with increased spending, we've had natural inflation. Because one thing we haven't necessarily talked about in this is that inflation can be both artificial and it can be natural. You can have artificial inflation through monetary supply expansion. However, you can also have natural inflation through supply and demand. If you have much greater demand than there is supply, then naturally the price of something is going to start to rise. And so throughout kind of the 60s and 70s, we had this massive boom in population. And so we saw the American dream kind of really start to prosper. And this is where people, you could live a normal way, you could kind of earn a normal wage, and you could go out and buy a house, you could have a 3-4 person family, you could have the nice car, you could have this kind of stuff. But now we're at an issue where people are not necessarily having kids to the same extent. In some countries, we're starting to see population decline. And so what we're starting to see is the natural deflation, whereby over time, the price of the things are dropping. One, because no one is buying anymore because the population is contracting. But two, because we live in a technological world where with this technological advancement, everything over time, we're always trying to get more for less. And so if you think about it, a car was always better than a horse because we could always consume a lot less energy and make it so much further. Or you look at like Blockbuster was significantly inferior to Netflix because suddenly you have all of these movies stored into a single location. In all of these kind of examples, you're always trying to get more for less. And that should mean that over time, our cost of things declines. And going back to the Fed mandate is to have stable prices and inflation of 2% and maximum employment. But the interesting thing is, if you think about that, it breaks down. If we live in an inherently inflationary environment, then how can we have a natural increase or stable prices? Because prices should actually decline over time. They shouldn't increase over time. And then on top of that, if we're having a strengthening currency because we have something, say, like Bitcoin, and we live in this deflationary environment, well, then naturally people can work less with the same output. So over time, we go back into, say, a Renaissance period where people are able to spend more time doing the things they want, spend more time being creative, spend more time with the people they care about. And so I believe that it is a fallacy that we need to work 40 hours a week. And that's not saying that we need to be lazy. I think that we are just accustomed to living in this labor workforce. And I think that that is a construct of government. I don't believe it is a construct of our natural society. And so the chasm we face right now is basically, how do we move from this inflationary system and with the debt burden that we currently have into this new modern digital system where everything, we kind of acknowledge that we live in this deflationary world, everything is kind of getting cheaper over time, but we also have a digital identity and the metaverse and stuff. Yeah.
And I mean, do you think the metaverse has a chance of being decentralized? I've always thought of it as just my euphemism for it, or just I just always think it's going to be centralized. I never really thought even of a decentralized metaverse.
100%. I think that, like, the first thing I would say is, I think the metaverse is misconstrued in most ways when people talk about it. Like, of course, it's open to interpretation. So my interpretation could be completely wrong. But the way I kind of view the metaverse is, we are already in the metaverse because we interact so much on these digital platforms. So like you and I right now, we've never met in person. We're interacting on a digital platform. Right. We've talked on Twitter. We kind of tweet about our experiences on Twitter. We pay for money over our mobile phones. We communicate with our friends and loved ones through text or through Messenger or whatever it may be. Already, the way we interact with the world is predominantly through a digital medium. Now, I would argue that that is the metaverse. It's not this like Ready Player One where we're in this virtual world and we're all running around and we can be whatever we want to be. That's more of the gaming side of the metaverse. And so I would argue that we are in the metaverse right now. And so, yeah, going back, sorry, I completely blanked on it. I don't think it feels like I answered your question.
Whether the metaverse could be decentralized.
Yeah, and so to answer your question, I think that we already interact with all of these centralized companies. And so because we already interact with all of these centralized companies, I think it's really challenging to suddenly transition over to a decentralized metaverse. And most people would say, yeah, but they're doing that with all of these other altcoins. The thing that I would say is that Bitcoin was in a really unique position because it was the first and Satoshi stepped back and kind of gave it to the people. It was never under the scrutiny of this like decentralization, centralization before it really became a thing. And by the time it did, it was fully decentralized. Whereas everything in reality has to start out centralized in order for it to become decentralized, because someone has to come up with the idea. Someone has to build the platform. There has to be a group of people that initially implement the idea and whatever that may be. And so I would say that it's going to be really, really challenging to transition over to a decentralized metaverse. I hope that it is true, and I hope that we can do it. But I think that it's going to be very similar in a sense that we're going to see Facebook or Microsoft or Google kind of have a big chunk in the decentralized metaverse. And the other reason why I would say that is decentralization has a massive flaw. And the major flaw of decentralization is its ability to pivot and take on new, more risky kind of endeavors. Decentralization works really well because it relies on consensus. It works really well at building like a stable platform. And so what I would say is that we have to think about what we want to be decentralized and what we want to be decentralized and what we want to be centralized. And so there's certain things that benefit immensely from being decentralized, and then there's certain things that benefit immensely from centralization. And centralization isn't all bad. And so our monetary system is one of those things that we don't want this ability to pivot to the next greatest technology and the ability to change our monetary system and our monetary goals overnight. We want to have this stability as a store of value. And so I would argue that our monetary system should be one of those things that's decentralized. Whereas when you're looking at a lot of these tech startups that are starting this new web app or whatever, I would say that they don't necessarily need to be decentralized just because they're trying to test out new ideas. They're trying to help grow our understanding of technology. And if they're decentralized, they fall prey to this ability that they're slow to shift and they're slow to move because you require that consensus.
Yeah. Very interesting points and interesting perspective there. I really struggle with, yeah, I mean, I see most of it being KYC'd and sort of centralized, but I have the same hopes and vision, I think, that you do as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. And my final question for you is, you just recently wrote a great piece with Greg Foss. So how did that come together? Did Foss just call you up and ask you to write a whole piece and put his name on it, or how does something like that come together?
It goes back a little bit. Being new to the Bitcoin space about 2.5 years ago, I decided to kind of like, the way I kind of approach things is I go deep down the rabbit hole. I read absolutely everything I can. I read all the books I can. I listen to all the podcasts I can. And I started to kind of feel like, hey, I'm starting to get like the hang of this thing. And being a mountain bike instructor, I love educating people. My whole background is built on trying to just educate people. And maybe like the majority of it is because I want to obviously help people, but there's also a selfish part of it, which it helps me. And it's probably the same with your podcasting. There's probably the selfish part, which it benefits you and it benefits me because we're distilling our ideas and we're also hearing new thoughts. And so the selfish part of me is I wrote my first article, and I wrote this in maybe March or May of last year. I can't 100% remember. And I put it out there with no hopes. I'm not a big social media person. And I put it out there with no real hopes. I was just like, you know what? I've distilled my thoughts. This helps me understand how the system is kind of structured. And it talked about inflation and wealth inequality. And I put it out there. And at the bottom, I tagged Preston Pish and Greg Foss and a couple other, Michael Saylor. And I just said, these people are really valuable leaders in the space. You should follow them. And Greg Foss saw the article and read the article. And at the time, I was like a fanboy. I was just completely blown away. And he shared the article. And I ended up obviously speaking to Greg Foss, and he gave me kind of some compliments on the article. And then he says, hey, I come out to Whistler, which is where I'm located in Canada. I come out to Whistler, which is a phenomenal ski resort, and I ski here. Do you want to go for a ski sometimes? I was like, oh my God, 100%. And so he came over to my place for a beer. We ended up going skiing and kind of catching up. And that's kind of like how our friendship developed. And that was about just under a year ago. And since then, I've just been kind of obviously watching the space and following things. And on one of the podcasts, he was talking about Bitcoin as an option. And now my background for 2 or 3 years, I was heavily into researching options. And then for around 5 years, I started trading options. So I've got a deeper understanding of kind of how options function and how options work. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, do you want me to have your options piece? And he said, oh, actually, I haven't even written the options piece yet. And he mentioned that he'd started writing it, and he was like, I haven't written it yet. So do you want to collaborate on this piece? And I was like, oh, 100%. And I think where a lot of people, I think Greg is absolutely phenomenal in the way that he is able to articulate really complex subjects and kind of like bridge the traditional world into the kind of the Bitcoin world. And the one place that he falls short is talking to like the layman and bringing it really down and dumbing it down. And so I said, how about you talk at the level you want to talk at, and I'll introduce it with part one, and I'll introduce the concepts of Bitcoin as an option. And then you can go in depth into whatever it is you want to go into. And I found like we got really good feedback and people loved it, because I think a lot of the time people want to be involved and they want to understand these more complex terminology, subjects, whatever it may be. But a lot of the time there's not much of that bridging content that helps move them over or explains it in the same article. And so I'm really proud of that piece. And I think Greg's pretty stoked with it as well. And I feel pretty blown away that he even wanted to collaborate on a piece.
Yeah, it's a great piece. And I love how you guys frame Bitcoin as a put on a put. It's just really great framing there.
I think that brings up one good quick point. And I think that is that we're right in the middle of Bitcoin, I think, being around 35,000. I only check the price once every few weeks, but we're at the moment, Bitcoin is around 35,000, and it scares off a ton of people in this price volatility. And what I would say to people that kind of they get fearful when they see Bitcoin kind of collapsing in price is that this isn't about the short term. We can look at this and we see the price, and yes, it's easy to get kind of scared away. But in reality, what Bitcoin is, it's insurance on the collapse of our current system. And when our system is shocked so much, eventually people are not going to be searching for the dollar. They're going to be searching for something that they believe is going to maintain its store of value properties. And I think that thing will be something like Bitcoin, Gold may play a role, but I really do believe that as we're moving towards the digital age and this crossing of the chasm, I believe that people will be searching for things such as Bitcoin. And so I would say that we shouldn't be scared of seeing Bitcoin in the short term with this price volatility, because at the moment, people are still viewing it in relation to other assets. But the reality is when our system does succumb to the amount of debt that it has, I think people will be searching for a better store of value. And I think Bitcoin is the perfect example of that. And the last little thing that I would just say on top of that is, if you haven't listened to Greg gives a really good example of how to understand this. And the way I think about this and the way kind of he thinks about this is that Canada, for instance, has a debt to GDP of 450%. So that means for every $1 of GDP, $1 of earnings in Canada, there is $4.50 of debt. Now, if you think that the average interest rate on that debt, so that's household debt, that is consumer debt, that is government debt, if you think that average interest rate is 3%, well, 4.5 times by 3% is about 13.5. So that means that each year the debt is growing by 13.5% just on the interest alone. Well, if GDP is only growing at, say, 2-3%, which is what it's historically growing at, well, then suddenly 13.5% minus the 3% gives us 10.5% debt growth every year, even if we're growing at 3%. It is impossible. It's an absolute impossibility that we can pay down our debt, like absolute impossibility. And so this is why I want to have this store of value in my portfolio. One, because obviously it protects me in the event that our economy faces this massive credit shock. But two, because I truly believe that it benefits the human race and prosperity moving forward, because we're moving across to something that cannot be corrupted by those in power, and it is under the control of the community and no individual.
Yeah, I agree with all those points. And I think that it kind of makes it feel like being a Bitcoiner is like living in the future and waiting for everyone to catch up. And it can be incredibly frustrating because you beyond sort of the price appreciation of purchasing power impacts, the other things, the altruistic impacts, I think, on humanity are just beyond reason. And you make a great case for that. I definitely leave the floor to you for parting words. I want to thank you so much. It's been so dope. If you could maybe share some life lessons or lessons you teach, maybe mountain bikers, that maybe apply to volatility or, avoiding silly risk. I'm not sure, but I'm sure you have interesting words for, mountain bikers that are learning.
Well, I would say there's so much that kind of like transitions across between whether it's sports, whether it's investing. And I would say the biggest thing is just like recognizing what your risk tolerance is, because recognizing your risk tolerance is so important, especially when it comes to Bitcoin. A lot of the time, and I've done this myself, is you go in heavy because you're like, okay, I understand Bitcoin, this is phenomenal. And then you take a 50% pullback or a 60% pullback, and it's hard to hold through those things. And so if I had invested absolutely every single thing and I'd sold everything I've got and invested in Bitcoin, it would definitely, I think it would have potentially have shaken me out. But the thing is, I recognize that this is something that, because of the potential upside, I think you don't necessarily have to exit your whole life in order to move into Bitcoin in order to benefit from this. I think that you can put 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, even though well above 50% of my net worth is now in Bitcoin, you can put a small percentage of Bitcoin into Bitcoin and still benefit immensely. But I wouldn't get too confident or cocky until you really have gone through part of the volatility cycle, because you may have the knowledge, but knowledge quickly washes away when it's down 50%. And it's really, really hard to face those 50% drawdowns. And so I would say, like, for anyone who's kind of entering the space, just think about like your risk tolerance and dip your toes in. You don't necessarily have to go all in on the first day. And like, I know Swan Bitcoin and a bunch of other companies, they do discounted, what's it called? DCA. My mind's gone blank. But anyway, just slowly enter in piece by piece as opposed to just jumping straight in, because you'll shoot yourself in the foot when it drops 50%. Yeah, but other than that, no, I'd say like I really value everything you do for the community, and I think your podcast is phenomenal, Cedric. And I think that, as we were talking about pre-show, I think our world right now is very fiat focused, and we see that in the news, and we see that in the media, and we see that in the content people consume, and they're focused more on headlines and these short bite-sized pieces, and they're not focused on these longer form content pieces, whether it's an article, whether it's a book, whether it's an hour and a half, 2 hour long podcast. And I think the reality is the real value in life comes from reading these books or reading these articles and listening to these long form content. I don't think that it comes from listening to a tweet or reading a tweet or reading the next biggest headline. And I think that if we can shift our perspective to this longer form content, we're going to help raise the education of, whether it's financial education, whether it's just education in general, of people globally. And I think that's huge. So I really value everything you kind of do for the community. And I'm sure everyone else who's listening to this values everything you do for the community.
Well, I really appreciate your kind words. I imagine that you're up on the mountain for weeks, living a very low time preference lifestyle, and only checking the price every few weeks. Very interesting. I appreciate your articles. They're very powerful pieces. I'd love to have you back on the show sometime to get into that more. Maybe you could let people know where they could find your articles. I know you're not on Twitter too much, but let people know where they could find you there as well. But thanks again. This has been so dope, Seb.
For sure. Yeah, no, and you can find me on Twitter at Seb Bunney, which is just SEBBUNNEY. And it's got an EY at the end of Bunny because most people think it's just the animal bunny. And then you can also, I write for Bitcoin Magazine, so you'll find a lot of the articles on Bitcoin Magazine. And at the moment, I'm actually working on with another guy called Daz Bea, which is DAZBEA, Greg Foss, and a few other guys. We are building out a Bitcoin educational course and platform where we're kind of trying to introduce slightly for more long form course content so people can learn about like how our system works, and it can kind of lead you through into kind of Bitcoin from a more of an objective place. And of course, there's always going to be bias because we believe in Bitcoin, but it's going to try and like lead you through so you can make up your own mind. But most people, I believe, will realize that Bitcoin is this pretty pristine, incredible asset.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Thank you so much. This has been so dope.
Thanks a lot.
Seb Bunney on the truth behind Bitcoin's opposition right here on the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. This episode was brought to you by Citadel Cabins, CipherSafe, Ledin, and the Bitcoin 2022 conference. If you take your Bitcoin security seriously, go that extra step and secure it from physical disaster with a CipherWheel Siege storage device. Go to cyphersafe.io and use the code MATRIX for 10% off your order to keep your sats safe. Citadel Cabins exists to help individuals achieve shelter, rest, security, and location independence. Head over to citadelcabins.com to fill out an application now. Ledin.io is a secure, simple, and easy-to-use platform for managing and growing your digital wealth. If you want to see what it's all about and get $50 in USDC when you take out your first Ledin loan, head over to start.ledin.io/Bitcoin Matrix. Bitcoin 2022 is the largest Bitcoin event in the world that takes place April 6th to 9th in Miami Beach, Florida. All 4 days will be jammed-packed with exclusive content, exciting announcements, and an incredible lineup of Bitcoin speakers, artists, and leaders. Make sure to use the code Bitcoin Matrix at checkout to get a 10% off your order, and I will see you in Miami. And thank you for listening. Stack sats, stay humble, and stay laser focused out there. This is Cedric. Peace.